Elias Thorne stood on the sun-baked lip of what he now called the Great Basin. 3 weeks ago, this colossal, craterous hole had been a shimmering turquoise invitation to summer. Now it was a tomb. It smelled faintly of pulverized concrete, sun-scorched earth, and the ghost of chlorine, a sterile, final scent that Elias breathed in like freedom. The demolition crew had finished the final grading an hour ago, leaving behind a scarred, 9,000-square-foot testament to compromise, exhaustion, and the high cost of peace. He was wearing jeans that were permanently caked with a fine white dust and a t-shirt stained with sweat and old oil. His hands, calloused and scraped from hauling fence panels and draining pipes, rested on his hips as he surveyed the damage. He wasn't just looking at the physical absence. He was looking at the 7 years of his life Marla Jennings had stolen, brick by painstaking brick. When Elias and his wife Sarah had bought the house, the 20-year-old in-ground pool was the centerpiece, a slice of Mediterranean luxury in their otherwise drab suburban cul-de-sac. It was, unfortunately, adjacent to Marla Jennings's property line. Marla, a woman who treated neighborhood covenants not as guidelines but as sacred, immutable law handed down personally to her, had immediately declared war. The war had been fought over decibels. The laughter of his kids, the filtration system's quiet hum, the gentle splashing from a late-night float. To Marla, these were instruments of psychological torture. The city code stipulated that residential noise must not exceed a certain level at the property line after 10 p.m. Elias had spent thousands soundproofing, installing a near-silent pump, and constantly policing his own family, only to be met with weekly certified letters, Show A fines for inadequate fence aesthetic, and the constant chilling presence of Marla's shadow, perpetually lurking behind her plantation shutters. The breaking point had come 2 months ago. His 9-year-old daughter, Lily, had invited a friend over. The friend, giddy with excitement, had let out a piercing, genuine shriek of joy when she cannonballed into the deep end. That single, honest sound, Marla had argued in her meticulously typed 12-page complaint to the city's code enforcement office, constituted a malicious and repeated violation of peace and enjoyment, and she had documented it with a sound meter reading taken from her master bedroom window at precisely 3:47 p.m. on a Saturday. The city, tired of the endless back and forth, gave Elias an ultimatum: raise the fence to an impossible height, or pay a 5-figure fine retroactive for months of documented non-compliance. Elias, defeated, looked at Sarah, who just shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. It's not worth it, Elle. Nothing is worth having Marla as a neighbor if she holds this over us. And so, he had hired the crew. The dismantling had been brutal, emotional, and expensive. A cool $22,000 to professionally break up the concrete, drain the chemical-laced water, dispose of the liner, and haul away the debris, filling the void with imported clean soil to prevent future structural issues. He had even called the city 3 times yesterday to ensure the permit for removal was properly closed out, the final inspection scheduled, the paperwork filed. He had done everything right. He was legally, morally, and emotionally done. Elias had just opened a lukewarm beer, resting against the dusty bed of his pickup truck, savoring the silence, a deep, satisfying, earned silence when the first siren started. It was distant at first, a mournful wail on the main road, but it grew quickly, closer, then closer still, until the sound was splitting the air of their quiet suburban street. Elias frowned. Was there an accident? He walked around the back of the pickup and saw the red and blue strobing lights reflecting off the neighbor's garage door, Marla's garage door. The source wasn't the street, it was his street. 2 black and white patrol cars, sleek and intimidating, were pulling to a stop at the curb directly in front of his house. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, the kind that tasted like fear and stale exhaustion. He hadn't done anything. The pool was gone. The yard was a mess, sure, but it was his mess, and he had permits for the construction. A moment later, the driver's side door of the lead vehicle opened, and a large, stoic officer named Reynolds stepped out, followed by a younger, more nervous-looking officer, and then, Out of her own front door, gliding across her manicured lawn like a predator tasting blood, came Marla Jennings. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't even hurrying. She was walking with a deliberate, slow, regal pace, her shoulders back, her gaze fixed on Elias. She was holding a manila folder, the notorious folder. The one Elias knew contained printed-out satellite images, meticulously logged dates, and complaints filed in triplicate. The late afternoon sun caught the slight, vicious upturn of her mouth. She looked like she had just won a lottery she had personally rigged. Elias felt the adrenaline spike, turning his weariness into hot, pure fury. He slammed his beer down onto the tailgate. "Marla, what the hell is this?" Elias shouted, striding toward the front yard, wading through the loose gravel the crew had tracked. Officer Reynolds, a man whose face seemed permanently set in an expression of weary skepticism, raised a hand. "Sir, calm down. We received a detailed report from Ms. Jennings here regarding a severe and unaddressed property code violation." Elias stopped 6 feet from the officers, gesturing wildly back at the massive empty hole in his backyard. "A violation? Officer, look! Look at my yard! The violation was the pool! I took it down! I spent $22,000 to remove the violation. Where is the problem?" Marla stepped smoothly forward, holding the manila folder pressed against her chest like a shield. Her voice, usually sharp and thin, was suddenly modulated into a tone of victimized concern, the voice she always used for authorities. "Officer Reynolds, with all due respect to Mr. Thorne, his current state of agitation merely proves his willful defiance. The original complaint, filed and duly stamped by the city on July, a copy of which I have here, was specifically about the inadequate safety fencing and the high concentration of unauthorized chemical runoff into the storm drain." She paused, allowing the officers to absorb the words unauthorized chemical runoff. The pool itself, while a nuisance, was not the primary legal issue. The lack of proper, legally compliant safety abatement was. Elias stared at her, dumbfounded. "You are unbelievable. The fence was pulled down 2 days ago, Marla, because the whole pool structure was being demolished. You watched the whole crew do it. You took pictures of the bobcat." "Yes, pictures documenting the removal of the already insufficient barrier," Marla cut in sweetly, turning to the younger officer. "Which, as you can see, leaves a massive, unmitigated 15-foot deep hole in the ground, completely unfenced, accessible to any child or neighborhood pet." She shifted her gaze back to Elias, and the mask slipped for a horrifying second, revealing cold, pure malice. Taking down the pool, Elias simply traded one violation for a far more dangerous one. It is now an unsecured, hazardous construction site, and one that is actively being used to improperly dispose of waste, according to my observations. The twist hit Elias like a physical blow. She hadn't complained about the ghost of the pool. She had weaponized the act of its destruction. The fence that had surrounded the pool was gone, replaced by temporary construction netting the crew had left behind, netting that was clearly insufficient to meet the city's standard for a permanent pool fence, and almost certainly insufficient for a massive, earthen hole. Officer Reynolds sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He was clearly familiar with Marla, but she had delivered her complaint with perfect bureaucratic precision. "Ms. Jennings has a point, sir. The initial complaint regarding the safety barrier for the pool structure may be technically moot, but a large excavation site like that, by city ordinance, needs clear, permanent perimeter fencing. You're responsible for maintaining the safety of the site. Leaving it open is unfortunately a violation, but it's been closed out. The city knows it's being filled," Elias pleaded, pulling his own phone out, his hands shaking as he desperately searched for the email from the demolition company. "I have the fill manifest. It's all clean soil." But that brings us to the second and far more serious matter," Marla said, a note of triumph leaking into her voice. She opened the manila folder with a crisp snap. "The chemical runoff. As you know, the city mandates that pool water must be dechlorinated and pH neutralized before being pumped into the storm drains to avoid ecological damage. I have dated photographs, starting from last Tuesday, showing water, clearly greenish in color, highly chlorinated, being pumped directly into the street grate from your property at high volume. I also have witnesses." The blood drained from Elias's face. He knew the crew had drained it properly. He had watched them do the first 2/3. But the last portion, the small, shallow amount left at the very bottom that required a sump pump and took hours, he had left that to the crew chief, Marco, relying on Marco's word that it would be handled legally. Marco said he did it right. He said he used the neutralizer. Elias roared, taking a step toward Marla. Officer Reynolds instinctively placed a hand on his sidearm, a silent, heavy warning. "Step back, Mr. Thorne. Do not approach Miss Jennings." Marla, completely unfazed, glanced at her watch. "And my latest complaint, filed just this morning, officer, regards the disposal of the debris." Elias didn't go inside. He couldn't face the sterile domestic comfort of his kitchen while a 40-foot wide, 15-foot deep wound bled out in his backyard. He stood on the driveway for an hour, the 2 citations, one for the unsecured site, one for the environmental violation, crumpled tight in his fist, the paper damp with sweat. The gravity of the injunction was slowly crushing the last vestiges of his hope. Cannot build a shed, deck, or even plant a tree taller than 3 feet. It was a permanent, spiteful freeze on his land, designed to keep the Great Basin an expensive, visible mockery. Sarah found him there, leaning against the cold metal of the garage door. She had clearly seen the patrol cars leave, but she hadn't come out until the silence was absolute. Her face was pale, her features tight with controlled fury. "What did she do, Elle?" Sarah's voice was low, shaky. Elias straightened up, trying to look like the man who could fix this, not the one who had just been expertly financially ambushed. He handed her the citations and the notice of the active lien. Sarah read the papers quickly, her eyes widening, then narrowing into 2 burning slits. When she reached the court order stating the injunction, the paper trembled violently. $1,400 in old fines. "And she got a judge to stop us from filling in the land?" Sarah looked out at the empty yard, then up at Marla's silent house. She didn't want the pool gone, did she? She wanted a trophy. "She used the removal as a trap," Elias confirmed, his voice flat. She waited until the barrier was down to call the safety violation, and she either paid off the crew or, worse, dumped her own pool chemicals to set up the environmental charge. That lien was the anchor. She knew the demolition wouldn't nullify the debt. "She locked us into the hole, Sarah." Sarah dropped the papers, her hands covering her mouth in a horrified gasp. She was angry, but there was no condemnation for Elias, only cold, pure hatred for Marla. "We can't afford this, Elle. Not after the demolition cost." "The house." "She won't get the house," Elias stated, the words a vow. "I'm not fighting the safety violation. I'll hire a real fence crew first thing tomorrow. I'm not fighting the lien yet either. I'm going after the environmental charge. That's the weak link. If I can prove she fabricated the chemical runoff, the judge will have to look at the injunction and the lien differently. It proves malicious intent. How can you prove that?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising. "She has photos, witnesses, probably official-looking documents. She plays this game better than anyone." "I'm going to find Marco, the crew chief," Elias said, already moving toward his truck. "He's meticulous. He logs everything. If he says he neutralized the water, and they have records, then Marla is the only other possibility. I need to know where they dumped the last of the water, and if anything looks suspicious." He grabbed his keys. The fight wasn't about the pool anymore. It was about survival. Marco Valenti's demolition yard was a sprawling, chaotic acreage 20 miles out of the city limits, smelling of diesel, wet dirt, and ozone. Elias found Marco in a makeshift office trailer surrounded by blueprints and half-empty coffee cups. Marco, a hulking man whose forearms were thicker than Elias's thighs, looked up, surprised and immediately defensive. "Elias, you're here about the notice, huh? I was just about to call you," Marco grumbled, running a hand over his shaved head. "Man, I'm sorry. I already got a call from the city attorney's office. They're launching an investigation into illegal chemical waste disposal. It's bad news, man. They're saying it's highly chlorinated water." "I know what they're saying, Marco. I got cited," Elias said, leaning heavily on the desk, his eyes boring into the demolition chief. "I didn't drive 20 miles to argue with you. I came for the truth. Did you dump raw chlorine water into a storm drain?" Marco exploded from his seat, knocking over a stack of permits. "Are you serious?" "Elias, I've been doing this 20 years. That's a $50,000 fine for my company. I use sodium sulfite to neutralize every job. It's recorded, mandatory, and expensive. Look. Marco stomped over to a filing cabinet, pulled out a thick logbook, and flipped it open. His heavy finger stabbed at an entry. Look at the timestamp. August 28th, 11:30 a.m. 35 lbs. Sodium sulfite added to the pool bottom. Circulation started for 3 hours. Final pH test 7.2, neutral. It's right here! My guys signed off. My name's on the line. Elias felt a surge of cold triumph. Marco was angry but genuinely honest. Okay, Marco, I believe you. Now tell me exactly where you ran the sump pump line for the last bit of sludge. Marco pointed to a site map taped to the wall. Right here, the closest drain point to the pool shell. It's the grate where your driveway meets the curb. We ran the hose straight under that big old hedge of marlas. We couldn't see the curb from the bottom of the basin. Wait, the hedge, Elias repeated, staring at the map. Her massive boxwood hedge that separates her sidewalk from the street? Yeah, that one. It's dense, man. And that's where things got weird now that I think about it, Marco said, lowering his voice, his initial defensiveness replaced by professional concern. We were using the sump pump for the final 20 gallons, that thick, dirty bottom layer. My guy, Raul, swore he saw a small, thin PVC pipe coming out from under her hedge, angled slightly toward the grate. It wasn't the main storm system pipe, just a little white plastic thing, almost completely covered by dirt and leaves. Raul said he thought it might have been an old landscape drain from her yard, but it was right next to our drainage hose. Did he touch it? Elias asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. No, just noticed it. Raul said it looked like it was actively weeping water, but that could have been condensation. He thought it was weird enough to mention, but we were focused on the final pump-out. Elias leaned back, the chilling clarity of Marla's plan coming into focus. She hadn't dumped water during the main process. She had built a covert delivery system to dump a highly concentrated chemical solution, maybe a few gallons of raw, industrial-strength chlorine shock she had bought online at the precise moment Marco's crew finished the final clean pump-out. She took her picture of the highly chlorinated water flowing into the street, knowing the environmental violation would stick because the city would only test the runoff, not the pool's source. Marco, thank you. You saved my skin. Send me a copy of this log and any photos your guys took of the drainage area. You bet, man. And good luck. She's a monster. Elias left Marco's yard with a renewed, cold resolve. He had found his truth. Now he needed proof to show a court. The first person Elias called was David Chen, his lawyer from the initial unsuccessful fine dispute. David was a good but overworked zoning attorney. David, it's Elias. I'm staring down a $1,400 lien, an environmental citation, and an injunction that locks my backyard into a dirt pit, Elias said, skipping the preamble. David's voice, coming through the phone, sounded tired and laced with pity. Elias, I saw the filing. Marla is thorough. Too thorough. She didn't just file complaints. She had a political ally at the Planning Commission push the lien forward last Tuesday. She knows people, Elias. This is textbook strategic harassment. What about the injunction? It's airtight for now. The judge granted it based on the history of violations and the immediate danger of the new environmental claim. It says until the lien is satisfied and the environmental case is resolved, you can't make any permanent changes. She framed me, David. The water was neutralized. I have the demolition crew's log. I think she dumped her own chemicals right after the crew left using a hidden drain. There was a heavy silence on the line. Elias, that's a very serious accusation. You have to prove it. Her word, backed by photographs and an official police citation, outweighs a crew's logbook. You need something physical, something that ties the chemical source back to her or proves she manipulated the scene. I'm going to look for that drain pipe tonight. Any advice? Just don't trespass. Don't go near her house. If she catches you on her property, this all gets thrown out, and you'll be facing criminal charges. Get photographs of anything on your side of the property line that suggests tampering. And Elias, if you find anything that proves malice, we don't file it with the court. We use it for leverage. We hit her with a countersuit for malicious prosecution and extortion that makes her wish she'd bought a condo in Siberia. Leverage, Elias repeated, the word tasting like a weapon. The sun had set. plunging the cul-de-sac into a velvety darkness broken only by the cold, yellow glow of the streetlights. Elias waited until 11 p.m., when all the lights in Marla's immaculate, fortress-like house were finally extinguished. He pulled on a dark hoodie, grabbed a pair of work gloves, a small, bright LED flashlight, the kind that focuses to a tight beam, and his phone. He moved silently across the damp, freshly installed sod of his front yard, following the line of the boxwood hedge that marked the border with Marla's property. The air was cool now, carrying the faint, sweet smell of Marla's expensive, night-blooming jasmine. The hedge was dense, pruned into a perfect, impenetrable green wall. Elias got down on his knees, holding the flashlight beam low to the ground. He had to be quick. Any movement at the property line would immediately trigger Marla's security lights, or worse, her attention. He found the storm drain grate near the curb, where the crew had finished their work. He slowly began to trace the line of the hedge backward, toward the back corn. Elias crept back into his house, the tiny micro SD card feeling like a lead ingot in his watch pocket. He was breathing heavily, the adrenaline fading into a cold, sick anxiety. He had just gone from being a victim of civil harassment to a criminal in possession of stolen goods. He found Sarah sitting at the kitchen island, staring blankly at the crumpled citations. "What did you find?" she whispered, her eyes dark with fear. Elias pulled out the card and placed it on the polished granite counter. "I found the pipe, a hidden PVC drain leading directly from her yard to the street grate. And I found her surveillance camera hidden in the hedge, pointed right at it." He paused, forcing the next words out. "I took the storage card." Sarah's breath hitched. She didn't ask how he had taken it. She knew. She simply looked at the minuscule piece of plastic, the key to their survival, and saw a jail cell. If she catches on, that's theft. That's breaking and entering." "It's leverage," Elias corrected, remembering David Chen's cold, legalistic term. "She used a crime to bury us. We use her crime to dig ourselves out." They spent the next hour wrestling with the card. Elias drove to a late-night electronics store and bought a cheap SD reader, returning home to load the files onto his laptop in the darkened office. The tension was suffocating. Every flicker of the screen, every whir of the cooling fan sounded like a declaration of war. The files were encrypted naturally, but Marla's security system was clearly consumer-grade, not military. After 2 failed attempts and a near meltdown, Elias finally cracked the basic password, a predictable combination of her birth year and the street number. The video file loaded. It was time-stamped exactly 30 minutes after the demolition crew's official sign-off time. The footage was eerily silent, shot in grainy, high-contrast night vision. It showed the empty curb, the storm drain grate, and the final 20 feet of his own drainage hose lying slack after the pump-out. Then, Marla Jennings appeared. She wasn't wearing her usual pristine linen or her tailored gardening clothes. She was in dark sweatpants and a shapeless black jacket, her hair pulled back harshly. She looked like a professional operative. She carried 2 objects, a large 5-gallon bucket and a high-end smartphone. The camera clearly captured her kneeling by the hedge. She meticulously poured the contents of the bucket, a dense, pale, opaque liquid that shimmered unnaturally in the infrared light, into the exposed mouth of the hidden PVC pipe. She waited. Within seconds, a torrent of the same opaque liquid began spilling out onto the curb near the storm drain. It was a high concentration of undiluted industrial-strength chlorine, engineered to trigger the city's environmental test instantly. She didn't stop there. Once the bucket was empty, Marla slowly, carefully, pulled out her phone and spent a full minute taking high-resolution, flashlit photographs of the chemical runoff disappearing into the grate, capturing the precise, incriminating green tint of the reaction. Finally, she stood up, dusting off her hands with a satisfied, almost feral expression that sent a chill down Elias's spine. She glanced directly at the camera she had hidden, her own camera, as if confirming the shot. She was so arrogant, so convinced of her invisibility, that she recorded her entire act of felony environmental tampering. Elias and Sarah watched the silent 10-minute loop twice. When the video ended, The only sound in the room was the rapid thumping of Elias's heart. "We have her," Sarah breathed, leaning against Elias's shoulder. "We have everything." "No," Elias corrected, exporting the video onto 3 encrypted flash drives and then deleting the files from the laptop. "We have blackmail. David said this is inadmissible. If I present this, I have to admit to theft. We'll be in a criminal investigation. Marla knows that." Elias was waiting outside David Chen's downtown office at 8:00 a.m. He presented the flash drive not as evidence, but as a confidential discovery file. David Chen watched the video without speaking, his face expressionless. When Marla looked directly into the camera, David hit pause, Marla's triumphant, twisted smile frozen on the screen. "Good God, Elias," the lawyer finally muttered, running a hand over his tie. "This is beyond malicious prosecution. This is fraud, environmental tampering, and potentially falsifying evidence to a police officer. This is a felony. She did this to get the injunction. Can we use it to fight the citation?" Elias asked. "No, not directly," David confirmed, leaning back, the ethical tightrope walk evident in his voice. "The court won't touch stolen evidence. But we don't need the court. We need her lawyer. This is what we call a nuclear option in civil defense." David picked up the phone. "I'm calling her attorney, Mr. Harrington. I'm going to request an emergency, confidential, without prejudice meeting at 10 a.m. I won't mention the video. I'll just say we have incontrovertible, non-public information that renders her client's entire case, the environmental citation, the injunction, and the $1,400 lien, null and void, and may lead to her client's immediate criminal indictment." David watched Elias, his expression grave. "You understand, Elias, that if she calls our bluff, you may have to decide between giving up the video and facing the lien, or providing the video and facing a police investigation for the theft of the camera. This is where we force her to compromise." At 9:45 a.m., while Elias sat in the sterile waiting room of David Chen's office, the final shoe dropped. The front door of Elias's house burst open as Sarah rushed out, weeping, clutching a sheaf of papers. She found the temporary fence crew Elias had hired earlier, frantically digging post holes for the mandated site barrier. "Stop! Stop!" she cried, waving the papers. The foreman, a gruff man named Joe, frowned. "Ma'am, we have a city order for a Class A security fence. We have to finish before sundown. It's too late," Sarah sobbed, handing him the lead document. It was a thick packet, delivered by a registered process server moments ago. It wasn't a warning or a fine. It was a formal notice of accelerated intent to foreclose. Marla hadn't waited for the emergency meeting. She hadn't waited for the court date. Realizing the vulnerability of her camera, she had used her legal leverage to preemptively strike a crippling blow. She had convinced her political contact at the City Planning Commission to move the $14,500 lien from a pending debt status to an accelerated delinquency. The document, stamped with an official but likely forged, city seal dated that morning, stated that due to repeated, documented violations and suspected environmental crimes, the city had the right to enforce the lien immediately. The notice gave Elias 30 days to pay the full lien amount of $14,500, plus $4,500 in accumulated legal and administrative fees, a total of $19,000, or the city would begin proceedings to seize the property through a forced tax sale to satisfy the debt. The document even included a detailed color photograph of the Great Basin, now labeled hazardous, contaminated, and financially delinquent site. Marla hadn't just sued him. She was trying to take his house, and she was doing it by fraudulently accelerating a municipal debt. Elias's phone vibrated wildly on the table in David Chen's waiting room. He snatched it up. She did it. It's the house. She filed an intent to foreclose. 30 days. Sarah's voice was hysterical, barely audible through the sobs. Elias slumped back in the chair, the life draining out of him. The environmental charge, the stolen SD card, the lawyer's meeting, it was all secondary now. Marla hadn't come for compliance. She had come for the deed. The door to David Chen's office opened and David walked out, his expression grim. "Mr. Harrington is here. He's smug, Elias. He thinks he has us over a barrel." He wants a full written retraction and an apology from you for slandering his client." Elias stood up, the weariness gone, replaced by a cold, incandescent rage. He looked down at his phone, Sarah's panicked texts scrolling past the image of the notice of intent to foreclose. Marla was trying to steal his home, based on a crime she committed and a fraudulent city filing. Elias walked toward David, his jaw clenched. "Tell Harrington that the terms have changed. We don't want her to drop the citation. We want her to pay the $19,000 lien in full immediately to the city and then permanently dissolve the injunction. If she refuses, we submit the environmental fraud video not to the judge, but to the district attorney's office and the city ethics commission. Now!" David looked at Elias, seeing not a beaten man, but a predator. "She will say you stole the evidence. She will counterfile a police report right now." "I know," Elias said, his eyes blazing, "but an alleged theft of a microchip is a misdemeanor. Felony environmental fraud, falsifying police evidence, and accelerating a fraudulent municipal lien, that's prison time and professional disbarment for her lawyer if he's involved. She risks everything. We risk losing a house we can't afford to keep anyway." Elias reached into his pocket and placed the micro SD card onto the conference table, right on the polished wood between the two chairs reserved for Marla's counsel. "Go. And tell Mr. Harrington I expect a written settlement agreement signed and wired within 3 hours," Elias said, his voice hard as stone, "or the tape goes public." David Chen stared at the small black chip on the table, realizing he was about to launch a legal ICBM. He knew Marla Jennings would never back down without a catastrophic fight, and he knew he had just committed to one. The conference room felt like a pressurized vault, soundproofed against the city's din. Mr. Harrington, Marla Jennings's counsel, was impeccably dressed and radiating the condescending confidence of a man who believed the law existed only to serve those who could afford its best interpreters. He had his own thick file labeled Thorn Habitual Nuisance, sitting on the polished mahogany. "David, this is a waste of time," Harrington said, not bothering to offer a handshake. "Your client is in default. The city has initiated foreclosure proceedings. He is under criminal investigation for environmental discharge. We are here to receive his written apology and his schedule for payment, not to listen to slander." David Chen, usually mild-mannered, was taut and focused. He pushed the single, unadorned flash drive across the table, careful not to touch Harrington's file. "Mr. Harrington, before we discuss payment, I need you to review this confidential discovery file. It contains incontrovertible evidence of illegal acts committed by your client, acts which led directly to the foreclosure notice, the environmental citation, and the court injunction." Harrington scoffed, picking up the drive with 2 fingers as if it might contaminate him. He plugged it into his laptop with an elaborate sigh. As the high-contrast night vision footage began to play, showing Marla in dark clothing, her back turned initially, his posture remained aggressively bored. Then Marla knelt by the hedge. She began to pour the pale, thick liquid into the hidden pipe. Harrington's eyes widened only slightly, but the effect was like watching a dam crack under pressure. His smugness evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating fear. He fast-forwarded the video to the end, where Marla took the flash photographs, then rewinded to the moment she looked directly at the camera, her expression a terrifying blend of triumph and malice. He hit pause. Marla's frozen, villainous smile dominated the screen. Where did you obtain this?" Harrington's voice was low, strained. "As I said, it is confidential discovery. What matters is that your client committed a felony by knowingly discharging industrial-grade pollutants into the storm drain, fabricated evidence, and then filed a fraudulent police report based on that fabricated evidence to maliciously pursue a civil injunction and accelerate a lien," David said, leaning forward. "This video, submitted to the district attorney, ends her professional life, exposes her to environmental felony charges, and invalidates every action she has taken against my client." Harrington slammed his laptop shut, his hands shaking slightly. "You stole this, Chen. The camera was on private property. Your client committed burglary and theft. If you submit this video, you are submitting evidence of your client's criminal acts. We will file a police report immediately, and Elias Thorne will be arrested before the DA can even watch the first 30 seconds. We know, David replied calmly. But you see, the penalty for felony environmental crimes, police fraud, and civil extortion is prison, Mr. Harrington. The penalty for stealing a $200 camera chip is a misdemeanor and a fine. She risks everything. We risk a slap on the wrist for trespass. Elias, listening to the exchange from David's private office, felt a bitter exhilaration. They had successfully cornered her. David delivered the final blow. My client's terms are non-negotiable, and they expire at 1 p.m. today. Marla Jennings will pay the city of Oak Haven the full $19,000 to satisfy the lien immediately. She will instruct the City Planning Commission to dissolve the injunction against the Thorne property. In return, we provide the micro SD card, deleted copies of the video, and a signed non-disclosure agreement protecting her from civil liability for this act, but not criminal liability. We will not sign any document admitting to theft or trespass. We are trading silence for solvency. Harrington snatched up his phone and walked to the corner of the room, speaking in furious, hushed tones. Elias could hear the thin, reedy squeak of Marla's voice on the other end, growing louder, transitioning from disbelief to incandescent rage. After 3 minutes, Harrington hung up, his face a sickly pale color. She agrees to the terms, he ground out, pulling a clean pad of paper toward him. But she requires one modification. She will pay the lien. She will dissolve the injunction. However, she demands a personal, notarized affidavit from Elias Thorne, stating that he will never, under any circumstances, contact her, speak to her, or approach her property line again. A perpetual restraining order based on the alleged theft. Elias, hearing this through the intercom, shook his head violently. She's trying to control his presence on his own land. Absolutely not, David declared. That is an admission of guilt designed to keep her safe while we are bound. We will sign the NDA, nothing else. The deadline stands, Mr. Harrington. Pay the $19,000 lien to the city by 1 p.m., or the video goes to the DA at 1:01 p.m. Harrington stood up, smoothing his jacket. The professional sheen was back, but his eyes were hard and venomous. You leave me no choice, Chen. I will advise my client to comply. But be aware, Mr. Thorne has crossed a line. You may get your injunction lifted, but Marla Jennings does not lose. She simply changes tactics. You've launched an ICBM, but the fallout will burn your side of the fence too. He stalked out, taking the copy of the video with him. David leaned back in his chair, scrubbing his face with his hands. That was the hardest negotiation of my career, Elias. Now, we wait. She'll pay, but she'll retaliate. We need to focus on her accelerated foreclosure notice, the one she filed this morning. We need to prove that City Seal was forged and that her contact at the Planning Commission acted illegally. That's how we hit her reputationally, legally, and permanently. Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the mahogany table where the SD card had sat. Start the paperwork on the forgery claim. I need her to pay, but I need her in legal trouble too. 5 p.m. The deadline was 5 minutes away. Elias and David were on the phone with Sarah, confirming that the city's online ledger had not yet registered the $19,000 payment. The tension was unbearable. She's waiting until the last second to transfer the funds, David muttered, checking his watch for the 10th time. Just then, the outer door of David Chen's law firm reception area burst open. It wasn't Mr. Harrington. It was 2 uniformed city police officers, the same 2 from the night before, Reynolds and his younger partner, followed by a grim-faced man in a suit carrying a clipboard. Officer Reynolds walked directly toward David Chen's office, bypassing the stunned receptionist. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes fixed on Elias. Mr. Thorne, we have a warrant for your immediate arrest, Reynolds stated, his voice devoid of emotion. Elias's blood ran cold. On what grounds, officer? On the grounds of felony. Burglary and grand larceny, Reynolds replied, holding up a sheet of paper. Ms. Marla Jennings filed a report at 12:30 p.m. today stating that you broke into her property and stole a high-definition security camera and internal storage device valued at over $3,500 to obstruct justice. We also have a signed warrant to search your person and your attorney's office for the stolen property. Elias stood up, his mind reeling. She hadn't waited for the deadline. She hadn't folded. She had chosen to ignore the environmental threat and use the theft charge as her ultimate counterstrike. She was willing to risk prison time herself if it meant seeing Elias Thorne behind bars first. The man in the suit, a detective, stepped forward and held out a plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag was a familiar object, the small green-domed security camera, now missing its micro SD card, which was still secured in Elias's private office. We recovered this from her hedge after she reported the break-in, Mr. Thorne, the detective said flatly. The value estimation of $30,500 includes the camera's highly specialized encrypted storage system, which classifies the theft as a felony. David Chen stepped in front of Elias, his face white with shock. Officer, my client has been waiting for a settlement in an active civil dispute. This is malicious prosecution. This is retaliation for attempted extortion. Save it for the judge, counselor, Reynolds said, walking toward Elias and reaching for his handcuffs. Mr. Thorne, you have the right to remain silent. Marla Jennings had won the first round of the legal counterattack. Elias Thorne, the man who only wanted peace, was about to be handcuffed and led out of his own lawyer's office, facing a felony charge and the very real possibility of losing his freedom. The cold steel of the handcuffs loomed in Officer Reynolds' hand. Elias felt a sudden suffocating certainty. Marla had calculated this perfectly. She had exchanged the near certainty of her own environmental felony, a political mess, for the immediate public humiliation and legal destruction of Elias Thorne, a common criminal charge. She was betting the $3,500 valuation of the camera would stick, guaranteeing Elias a felony record, and ensuring the micro SD card, the only evidence of her malice, would be sealed as stolen property. Mr. Thorne, do not resist, Officer Reynolds said. Stepping forward, David Chen lunged not toward the officers, but toward the man with the clipboard, Detective Stevens. Detective Stevens, please! You have an ethical obligation to review the context of this complaint. This is not larceny. This is an attempted frame-up, backed by official fraud. Detective Stevens, a tired-looking man with the calm eyes of someone who deals with small-scale civil feuds turning criminal every week, sighed. Counselor, I have a signed warrant based on a confirmed theft. We can discuss motive at the station. No, we discuss motive here because motive proves the crime is Marla Jennings's, not my client's. David grabbed the accelerated foreclosure notice that Elias had rushed to the office earlier, the document with the freshly forged city seal. Look at this, Detective. This was served 90 minutes ago. Your complainant, Ms. Jennings, orchestrated a fraudulent acceleration of a municipal lien using a forged city seal to seize my client's home. This is financial fraud, a separate felony, committed before she filed the theft report. She is using the police to cover her own financial crime. The word forged made the detective pause. The police often dealt with theft. They rarely dealt with financial fraud involving official city seals. He took the notice and held it up to the light, comparing the stamp to the seal on his own warrant. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible misalignment that Elias's forensic team had flagged earlier. We have already confirmed the official seal on this document is irregular, Detective. We were preparing to file a formal complaint with the DA when your officers arrived, David pressed, his voice lowering to a desperate, urgent pitch. She set the trap. She committed the environmental felony, got the injunction, then forged the foreclosure notice. My client stole the card to expose the environmental felony, which would have saved his home from the forged notice. The micro SD card proves all her underlying crimes. It's not larceny. It's evidence seizure by a man fighting for his life against a sociopath. Reynolds, annoyed, started to move again. Counselor, I don't care about the civil dispute. Then care about the environmental felony, David roared, cutting him off. David walked back to his private office desk, snatched the genuine micro SD card, and returned, holding it between two fingers. "We know your $3,500 valuation is exaggerated to make it a felony, officer. But this little chip right here is the real issue. Detective Stevens, I am giving you, and only you, this piece of evidence, which contains a clear, undisputed video of Marla Jennings committing felony environmental discharge and falsifying evidence to the police. If you arrest my client, this evidence is sealed, and a dangerous criminal walks free. If you take this chip and call the DA's Public Corruption Unit right now, you can secure a legitimate conviction that involves both environmental charges and official forgery." David shoved the chip into Detective Stevens' hand. "Don't arrest him. Investigate her." The tension in the room was electric. Officer Reynolds stood frozen, his hand still extended toward Elias. Detective Stevens looked from the chip in his palm to the forged city seal on the notice. Then, at the two uniformed officers waiting for instruction, he saw the political and legal minefield Marla had constructed. Arresting Elias would make the police complicit in covering up the city seal forgery. Stevens made a choice that would define his career. He nodded slowly. "Officer Reynolds, stand down," the detective commanded, his voice suddenly sharp and authoritative. "The circumstances of this theft are now highly irregular. We are pivoting. Mr. Thorne, you are not under arrest. But this micro SD card is now in police custody as evidence related to a new, high-priority investigation into environmental crime and alleged official fraud. You will remain here and provide a full statement. Marla's checkmate had failed. The next 5 hours were a blur of paperwork, depositions, and hushed phone calls between David Chen and the district attorney's office. Elias and Sarah, who had arrived frantic and terrified, sat in David's office while the legal machine ground forward, powered by the explosive contents of the single micro SD card. The district attorney realized the gravity. Marla Jennings had not only committed a felony, but she had successfully leveraged city infrastructure, the police, the planning commission, and the court to enact a private vendetta. The fact that she had accelerated the lien using a forged city seal while simultaneously trying to arrest Elias for theft was the ultimate act of hubris. At 4 p.m., the news was delivered. "It's over." "Elias," David said, sinking into his chair, physically and emotionally drained. "The DA has confirmed the city seal on that foreclosure notice was fraudulent. They have secured an emergency order to nullify the accelerated intent to foreclose because the document itself is a forgery. The environmental crime video is the DA's primary leverage now. They are not arresting you. They are granting you temporary immunity in exchange for your testimony against Marla." Elias and Sarah slumped against each other, the tension finally breaking. "What about the lien?" "The $19,000? Sarah whispered. "The original lien is still technically active," David explained. "But the environmental citation, the foundation of the injunction, is now provably fraudulent. The judge has to dissolve the injunction on those grounds. Marla is facing a criminal investigation that makes a $19,000 fine look like pocket change. We are submitting a countersuit for malicious prosecution, emotional distress, and fraud that will force her to pay the lien just to keep us quiet in the civil courts. She has nowhere left to run." The final, powerful beat came 3 days later. Not in a courtroom, but in the quiet, empty street of their cul-de-sac. Elias had hired a new, ethical landscaping and construction firm. The judge, acting on the DA's recommendation, had immediately dissolved the restrictive injunction. Elias was finally allowed to fill in the pit, the great basin that had become a monument to Marla's spite. Standing on his porch, watching the huge cement trucks arrive, Elias felt a strange, detached peace. The hole, his financial sinkhole and emotional prison, was finally going to disappear. Then he heard the commotion from across the street. Marla Jennings's house was no longer silent. There were 2 official-looking white vehicles with city seals parked at the curb, one marked City Planning and Permits, and the other Environmental Compliance Enforcement. Elias watched as a team of officials, led by Detective Stevens, approached Marla's meticulously manicured front yard. Marla, looking pale but still defiant in a sharp blazer, was arguing furiously with them on her front steps. Flanked by a visibly harried Mr. Harrington, an environmental officer pointed directly at the massive, dense boxwood hedge that had hidden Marla's crime. He then pointed to the drain near the curb. A crew began carefully, methodically, digging up Marla's front yard to locate the hidden PVC pipe and the point where she had attached it to her main plumbing line. Securing the physical evidence of her illegal discharge system, Marla screamed, a high, thin sound of pure, helpless rage as her pristine landscaping was violated. A few minutes later, Detective Stevens walked up to Marla and, completely ignoring her, taped a notice to her front door. It wasn't a warrant. It was a writ of temporary seizure from the city, freezing her assets and placing a massive new lien on her property, equal to the costs of the environmental cleanup and the city's forensic investigation into the forged seals. The notice also included a $200,000 bond requirement for the multiple felonies she was now facing. Marla Jennings, the woman who had sought to bury Elias under a $19,000 lien, now saw the government place a debt 10 times that size on her own. Perfect, impenetrable fortress. Elias and Sarah stood side by side, watching the karmic justice unfold. As the first truck began to pour clean, stabilizing fill into the Great Basin, Marla was escorted by her lawyer into her own house, now fully aware that her property, her reputation, and her freedom were all irrevocably lost. The next day, a small, discreet for sale sign was placed on Marla Jennings's lawn, slightly crooked from the digging. The last truck left Elias's property at sunset. The backyard was flat, fresh, and silent. The great hole was gone, replaced by smooth brown dirt, ready for grass. Elias stood in the empty space, finally able to breathe. He had won, but not by tearing down his pool. He had won by digging up the truth. The irony was heavy. He had faced down a powerful bully and kept his home. But the cost was the permanent loss of the quiet life he cherished. He and Sarah walked hand in hand inside, leaving the newly flat, silent yard to the rising moon. The pool was gone, but the ghost of the Great Basin, and the knowledge of what his neighbor was truly capable of, would forever be built into the foundation of their home.